welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Wednesday, November 16th. I'm your host for today's program, Paul DeMain, and today we go to Anchorage, Alaska and talk to Alaska Public Radio News Network Director Lori Townsend. Lori Townsend, welcome to the Native News Update at IndianCountryTV.com. Thanks for joining with us today, and say hi to the public and then tell us a little bit about what are the top stories coming out of Alaska that we're all interested in. That is, what happened with this huge storm that came through?
Well, hello, public, and hi, Paul. Nice to see you and to talk with you again today. Yes, we've had a number of big storms here in Alaska. Last week, it was quite worrisome. In the beginning part of the week, there was a massive storm heading for the western coast of Alaska, northwestern coast, up in the Nome, Kotzebue area. And it was very, very worrisome. It ended up being about what would have measured to be about a Category 3 hurricane.
Right.
And blew in. It didn't have the water surge that came after the initial storm was very, very concerning, but didn't end up being quite as large as they were afraid it would be. In 1974, Nome had a storm that had a storm surge that was 13 feet above tide level, came up over the seawall and caused damage. This storm last week was about 10 feet above, so quite significant, but not as big as that record in 74.
Well, you have some indigenous communities up there along the western shores, if I remember, that are just about washed out already from rising sea levels, and for a 10-foot surge, were some of those communities put underwater or close to it?
No, but I think the good thing that came out of this was that people were very, very organized. And I talked to one of the council members in Kivalina, an area of great concern, because they are right there on this little spit of land. And she told me that on the one hand, it was very, very troubling for the children of the village because they remembered being evacuated out in 2007 when there was a very bad storm. And her son, who was 8 years old at that time, is now 12. And when this storm came up, he immediately wanted to know, are we going to get out? Are we going to be evacuated? And she said when you see children on the street or at the school, they ask the same thing. She said it's very stressful for them, very traumatic, because at a certain point, they can't get out. They can't, no flights can come in or get out. No boats can come in or out. And so they have to make a decision at some point to either stay and just go to the school and higher ground or try to get out of there. So she said it's troubling for the kids, but she said they trained very well and their community responders were very well trained, very organized, and very calm, she said, which helped other people stay calm. Their big concern with the storm surge was water coming around into the lagoon, which it did do and broke up the lagoon ice. She said they gauged it at about 25 miles an hour, the incoming water. And so that was concerning, but they were able to, it didn't flood the village. And, they had some minor damage. A lot of villages had damage, roofs being torn off, and a few boats sank, things like that. We did lose
Saw
one
pictures
person.
of that, and there was one person missing, and they haven't recovered.
Right. A young man in Teller, small community up in the Nome area. And he had last Wednesday out riding a four-wheeler out on this area very close to the surf and was observed in a spot that was quite dangerous. And the assumption is that he got washed out to sea. There's been no sign of him since. And other than that, people fared quite well. The wonderful thing is that people came together and helped each other quite a bit. People brought traditional food to emergency shelters for some level of comfort. They brought muktuk and moose meat and caribou and other things to kind of help people have a little less stress during a time like this. So they kind of turned it into a community gathering. And some people did traditional dances, asking for better weather. So they did everything they could, and apparently it helped because they ended up okay.
Two observations. One, the fact that many of these communities that are along the shore appear to be more modern communities, houses and so forth, when my impression was is that these individuals moved around a little bit more and weren't quite as settled as this. And the question is I heard it was a storm that's like once in 100 years or maybe longer. They haven't seen it, but when these storms used to come in, I can't imagine them having traditionally stayed down on the shorelines there, that they would have had housing back somewhere else. And I did see one comment about it. Someone says, "Well, how are you guys faring up there?" And someone says, "We got a caribou on and we're fine." It was,
Well, a couple of things, a couple points about what you just said. Yes, people many years ago did have seasonal camps out by the water where they would harvest um, things from the sea and then move back to other places. But of course, schools got built in a certain spot, and a lot of those places were close to the water for a variety of reasons. Some of them may have been as simple as this is the easiest spot to get the building materials to on a barge, so here's where your new school is going to go. Um, and also, shore fast ice. There isn't the ice that gets built up before the storms come in that they used to have to protect the shoreline. So the village of Shishmaref, which has been having a lot of trouble with erosion, they lost between 20 and 30 feet in less than 24 hours during that storm. So they have three homes now that are within about 100 feet of the tide line.
mhm.
So the problem is, I talked to Mayor Wayawana up there, Howard Wayawana, and he said that uh, we used to have ice coming on earlier, and now it's not. And that's part of the problem is there's no protection there to buffer that chop that comes in from the ocean. There was also a big storm that came on the backside of this one that ended up in southwest Alaska that caused quite a bit of damage. And just in the last few days, we've had a big, strange, choppy wind situation come up in Sitka, and a couple of boats sank, and there was damage in the harbor there. And today in Anchorage, we have tremendous winds, which isn't all that unusual. We do have that happen from time to time where big winds come through, and we're getting that right now where gusts are up to, I guess, up to 60 miles an hour. It's very, very cold. We're expecting 25 below with wind chill tonight, and so it's an odd bunch of weather coming through. But all in all, Alaskans fared well. We're tough, and people did okay.
Yeah, 25 degrees below zero already in November. Wind, snow, 100-mile-an-hour winds, and you moved to Alaska to get into this beautiful kind of place. So
It's
we're
beautiful.
ready. We're ready for winter here and there. You were telling me when we went on that you had some information about some other records that people might find interesting. So we'll get back to you if it's a wild winter. We're going to want to talk about that and see if that's a reflection of global warming or something else. But what about these
Yeah.
other records?
Yes, just yesterday I had an opportunity to visit with a man who came up here in the late 60s specifically to record the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act hearings and all of the meetings that transpired around that time when they were formulating the ANCSA agreement. He has 5,000 tapes, both reel-to-reel audio and videotapes. He did the whole thing. He calls it, he's 82 years old now. He says, I recorded it all from stem to stern, which nowadays people would say C-SPAN style because it's unedited. So he recorded all these meetings, and the interesting thing and kind of troubling thing about this is that here he has this tremendous archive, which is an educational opportunity that's golden and waiting to happen, but he can't get anyone to help him transfer this to another medium. And they're sitting in his home, and he's uh,
Wow.
AFN, Alaska Federation of Natives, passed a resolution in 2005 to say that they would try to help him get some money to get these things transferred. There was a television news story about it in 2006, and people were really excited, and nothing's happened. So I'm hoping that we can generate some interest in this story because it is an educational opportunity that really needs to be out there for people to study.
I think there's a lot of records out there that people would donate if they have a place, and I would suggest, right coming to mind, Bob Sanderson and um, the group down at the Dan Littlefield, the Sequoia Research Institute in Little Rock, Arkansas, has a huge library of stuff. They've picked up actually trailers and trucks full of documents and records and tapes and reel-to-reels. And it's mainly a storage place, but they're working very hard to get that into modern digital forms. They're looking for the same thing. So if the person's worried about a repository, that's an opportunity, but it's also a place where maybe they can link with some programs. If someone sees this here and wants to come forward, I suspect that there are archives all over the world. Recently, some video footage, black and white, from the 1950s, that had to be very early on, showed up for Hayward, Wisconsin and Historyland with tribal people dancing, and they played it for the community, and people came in and identified people. That's 60 years old and needs to come off the tape and put on to a disc or something for historic purposes, and hopefully we can show that stuff at Indian Country TV and say, here is exactly what was being said. Here's the concerns of the elders, the clan mothers, the women in the community as they testified about the potential impact up here. Let's cut through all the other stuff.
Absolutely. Was the biggest land deal in the U.S. history, and people need to study that and know how the process worked, what may have been missing in the discussion. Interestingly enough, Mr. Imig, Chuck Imig, the man that has these archives, is also a psychologist by training. So we had a very good conversation about his conversations with people in the Native community here when he came to do this recording for them, and how he would ask them about, do you have the information that you need, and what else do you need to know? And he said that's a lot of the problem with what happens with these kind of situations is people need a certain amount of information, then they need to absorb that, figure out what else they need to know, and sometimes that was lost in the process. So there's a lot of opportunity for learning here. His biggest concern is that it doesn't just go someplace and sit. He's already had those offers where a couple of organizations have said, well, we can store it here if you'd like. And he says, I don't want it stored. I'm storing it. I want it to be out there so that people can use these in schools.
Transferred and made public and get interactive and give it to the children and the people of Alaska where all that information deserves. We've got about half a minute left. You got anything, other short things, or we can head out from here and talk to you again in another week or two?
Well, let's see. You put me on the spot.
What's your URL? Let's go there. You're always producing stuff every day. If someone wants to know what's going on in Alaska, what's the URL?
They should go to alaskapublic.org, and you can find these stories. Not the archiving story yet, because I still have to produce that story, but that'll be there soon. And
Okay.
but the storm coverage is there, and a lot of other stories as well.
We'll catch up to you again. Thanks. Great storms. No orange goo lately. You take care, Lord.
Thank you. You too, Paul.
And that is another roundup of news from Indian Country on this edition of the Native News Update. Thanks for joining with us, and come back again soon.